This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real events. Names, dates, locations, and identifying details have been changed or dramatized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental or used fictitiously. This content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not aim to glorify crime, promote violence, or pass judgment on real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. Some scenes may contain mature, disturbing, or triggering content. What you are about to watch could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It's inspired by real events. Whispers of truth buried beneath layers of fiction. We've changed the names, the dates, the locations, but the emotions, the betrayal, the fear, those are real. This story is not meant to accuse, only to reveal, to make you question, who do you really trust? If stories like this keep you thinking, long after they end, hit subscribe, smash like, and drop your theory in the comments. Now watch closely, before the truth disappears again.
The glow of street lamps stretched across a quiet Texas street. Houses stood in neat rows, their windows lit with the soft hum of family life. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, the summer air hung thick and warm, and a faint creak echoed as Angela Morris stepped onto her porch, watering her flowers in the fading light. To her neighbors, Angela was steady, polite, the kind of woman who kept her garden neat and her greetings brief. At work, she was Warden Morris, calm, respected, unflinching in a place where weakness could be exploited. And at church, she was a faithful presence, bowing her head in prayer each Sunday without fail. But behind those appearances was a woman shaped by longing. For 15 years, Angela and her husband Michael had lived in a house that remained silent of children's voices. Friends had babies. Neighbors raised families. The Morris home stayed the same. Angela's longing was written in the little things. A spare bedroom painted pale yellow, waiting. A second-hand crib draped in a sheet, unused. A box of baby clothes tucked into the back of a closet, unopened. She carried her sorrow quietly, but it lingered in her eyes whenever she saw a child run past her porch. Michael carried it differently. He was a man of few words, hardened by work, his silence steady and immovable. He never spoke of their childlessness, not once. It was as if the subject itself had been locked behind a door he refused to open. And then one day, something shifted. Angela's smile returned, faint at first, then brighter. Her step grew lighter. Neighbors noticed her humming as she tended her garden. At church, whispers began. Angela looks different, like something's changed. Even her colleagues at the prison remarked that she carried herself with a new kind of energy. Michael noticed too. After so many years of disappointment, he wanted to believe. Perhaps he thought this was the season their prayers were finally being answered. But her glow seemed private, as if it belonged to her alone. She didn't explain it. She didn't share its source. And when Michael asked, her answers were short, her smile guarded. Angela was holding something close, a secret, and secrets never stay hidden forever. What had Angela buried so deeply that it would one day shatter everything she thought was safe? The Morris home sat on a quiet stretch of road, its brick walls weathered but steady, its white shutters clean, its porch lined with the flowers Angela carefully tended each week. To anyone passing by, it looked like a picture of normalcy, a house where life followed a steady rhythm. Inside, the rhythms of that life were familiar. Michael rose before dawn, his alarm clock cutting through the silence of the early morning. He dressed for work with quiet efficiency, pulling on faded jeans and his scuffed boots, packing his lunch into the same worn cooler. By evening, he returned with sun-darkened arms and shoulders bowed by labor. He dropped into the same chair at the kitchen table, ate the dinner Angela set before him, and spoke only when necessary. His silences, once comforting in their steadiness, had grown heavier with the years. Angela's days began differently. She left the house each morning with her pressed uniform, driving to the prison where she became someone else. Behind those high gates, she was Warden Morris, a woman whose voice carried authority, whose eyes scanned every corridor with precision. In a place ruled by chaos, she brought order. Guards followed her lead. Inmates learned quickly not to test her. Few of them could have imagined the loneliness she carried home at night. For all their steadiness, the Morris marriage had been tested by one thing: the absence of children. For 15 years, it hovered over them like a shadow they could never step out of. Angela felt it most in the quiet of their house. She felt it in the yellow-painted spare room, its walls bare, its crib covered with a sheet. She felt it in the unopened box of baby clothes, folded neatly but never touched. She felt it at family gatherings where she smiled for photographs but blinked back tears when cousins handed her their infants. Michael carried it differently. He never spoke of it. Not once. If the subject arose, he brushed it aside, retreating into silence. To Angela, it was as if he had built a wall around his pain, a wall she could not climb no matter how hard she tried. She prayed in private, wrote the occasional note in a journal she kept hidden, and clung to hope even when it frayed. The world around them noticed only fragments. At church, Angela bowed her head in prayer, her hands clasped tightly as if squeezing the words into her palms. Neighbors remembered her as quiet but kind, always waving from the porch or bending over her flowers at dusk. To Michael's co-workers, she was simply his steady wife. Polite, dependable, the woman who packed his lunches and kept the house in order. But within their home, cracks were visible to anyone looking closely. Dinner conversations often faded into silence before plates were cleared. Angela lingered longer in the spare room, running her fingers along the edge of the crib before closing the door again. Michael sometimes sat in his chair long after the dishes were done, staring at nothing in particular, a half-empty glass of whiskey at his side. And yet, despite those quiet fractures, their home still looked whole. The porch light glowed at night, the garden bloomed in season, their church pew remained filled each Sunday. To anyone looking from the outside, the Morris family lived in peace. But peace can be fragile. Beneath the surface of that quiet home, Angela carried a longing that had begun to reshape her choices. And Michael, silent, watchful, unyielding, carried something too. Something he never spoke aloud. Cracks in a marriage don't always appear with shouting or broken glass. Sometimes they slip in quietly, in small, almost invisible shifts that build until they can no longer be ignored. Angela's change began gently. She lingered longer in front of the mirror before work, smoothing her uniform with unusual care. She hummed in the kitchen as she prepared dinner, her movements lighter, quicker. At church, a friend whispered that Angela looked renewed, almost glowing. To most, it seemed like a blessing after years of sorrow, but to Michael it felt different. At first he wanted to believe it. After so many years of emptiness, wasn't this what they had prayed for? For Angela to laugh again, to smile at the smallest things? Yet the joy he saw in her didn't feel shared. It was as if she carried a private light, one she refused to let him near. Angela grew guarded. She kept her phone close, stepping outside for calls that ended the moment he came within earshot. She returned home later, offering vague explanations about paperwork or staff issues. Michael nodded, but the unease pressed harder each time. The details seemed small, but they multiplied. A basket of laundry left half-folded. The back door left unlocked when it was always his habit to secure it. The way Angela's eyes slid away from his across the dinner table, as though she was holding something she couldn't say. One evening, while reviewing their bank account, Michael froze. A purchase appeared that didn't belong. Items no one in their home should have needed. He read it twice, 3 times, before setting the papers down with hands that trembled slightly. When he asked Angela about it that night, his tone was careful, almost pleading. She smiled faintly, brushing it aside, insisting he was imagining things. But her eyes told a different story. They held not irritation, not joy, but something closer to fear. At the prison, whispers spread quietly among the staff. Some noticed how often Angela stopped at a particular cell, how conversations stretched just a little too long. No one dared question her openly. She was their superior. But in a place built on secrets, silence often carried the loudest weight. Angela told herself she could manage it all, that she could balance the image of control with the secret she carried, that her professional life and private life could remain separate. But secrets leave traces, no matter how carefully buried. For Michael, suspicion turned heavier. He began to watch her closely, measuring her silences, noting the way her answers grew shorter when he pressed. At night, he lay awake long after Angela had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling while her breathing rose and fell beside him. The house looked the same from the street, its porch light glowing at night, its shutters neat, its garden blooming in season. But inside, it no longer felt ordinary. It felt like a place waiting for a truth to break free. The day began like so many before it. Michael rose before dawn, boots thudding against the porch steps as he left for work. Angela lingered behind, moving slowly through the house, the weight of exhaustion and secrecy in her every step. The Morris home looked ordinary from the outside, but inside it was holding a truth that could no longer be contained. Angela's secret had taken shape in the most undeniable way. She was pregnant. For Angela, it felt like the miracle she had prayed for over 15 years. The emptiness of their yellow-painted spare room finally had an answer. She glowed with a joy that neighbors couldn't help but notice. One woman from church remembered seeing her belly grow and whispering to a friend, "Her prayers have finally been answered." Angela herself walked differently, slower, softer, her hands often resting protectively against her stomach. But for Michael, the pregnancy was no blessing. It was a weight pressing against a truth he had hidden for decades. He knew what Angela did not. He could not father children. He had learned the truth in his 20s, long before their marriage, and buried it in silence, too ashamed to ever admit it. For years, that silence had been his shield. But now, with each passing month, as Angela's stomach swelled, the silence turned into a curse. He did not ask questions. He didn't need to. The whispers from the prison, the way Angela lingered too long by one inmate's cell, the bank statements for things they didn't need, they all pointed in the same direction. The children she carried were not his. They never could be. When the twins were born, Angela wept with joy. Two tiny lives, proof that hope could outlast years of disappointment. She held them close, believing she had been redeemed, that her years of emptiness had finally ended. But every time Michael looked at them, he saw betrayal etched in their faces. Not his features, not his blood. Only proof of a secret he had never spoken, exposed without a word. In the weeks after their birth, their home became a place of tension so thick it was suffocating. Angela devoted herself to the twins, her exhaustion matched only by her love. Michael withdrew further into silence. At night, neighbors saw him pacing in the yard, cigarette smoke curling into the air, his face darkened by something no one could name. Inside the house, conversations became sharp, clipped, or avoided altogether. The breaking point came one night after the twins had finally fallen asleep, their breathing steady in the small room down the hall. Angela stood in the kitchen, rinsing bottles under the warm water, her body heavy with fatigue. Michael entered, his footsteps deliberate, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her pause. At first, his words came as jagged questions. Where had she been spending her time at the prison? Why had she lied to him? Who had given her the children she now cradled? Angela deflected, pleading, trying to soften his anger with explanations she could not form. Then came the confession he had buried for years. He told her what she never knew, that he had always been infertile, that no matter how long they prayed or how hard they tried, there had never been a chance, that the twins in the next room could not possibly be his. Angela froze, the truth striking her like a blow. She tried to explain, tried to frame her choices as desperation born of love, of longing, of unbearable emptiness. But her words collapsed under Michael's fury. For him, this was not just betrayal, it was humiliation. A secret he had protected for decades had been ripped open and placed in front of him in flesh and blood. The argument grew louder, sharper, voices rising in a house that had been defined by silence. Angela pleaded. Michael shouted. The storm that had gathered for months finally broke, and then came the violence. It happened swiftly, brutally, rage overwhelming reason. Angela fought, but exhaustion and shock left her weak. Michael's fury left no room for mercy. When it was over, the house was silent again, but not the silence of sleep or routine. It was a silence so heavy it seemed to smother the walls themselves. The twins, voiceless and innocent, were caught in the same storm. Their cries rose briefly, then faded into the same stillness that had swallowed their mother. When the violence ended, Michael stood in the wreckage, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. Around him lay the consequences of secrets too long kept and truths too long hidden. The house that once held longing now held only absence. Neighbors later recalled strange signs that night: a flicker of lights at odd hours, the slam of a door, footsteps pacing back and forth. But no one imagined what was unfolding behind those white shutters. By morning, the Morris home looked unchanged from the street. The porch light glowed. The flowers sat in their neat rows. The shutters stood straight. But inside, the illusion of family had collapsed into a silence no one could ever repair. Morning broke quietly over the neighborhood, the sun casting a golden light across neat lawns and trimmed hedges. From the outside, the Morris home looked unchanged. The porch light still glowed faintly. The flowers Angela had tended still bloomed in rows. But inside, the silence was wrong. The first sign came when Angela did not appear in her garden. She always stepped out early, watering plants before the heat of the day, greeting neighbors with a nod. That morning, there was nothing. By afternoon, unease grew. Calls were made. Soon, the stillness of the street was broken by the low rumble of police cruisers pulling to a stop at the curb. Officers entered the home expecting routine, a welfare check, perhaps a fainting spell. But what they found was something no training could prepare for. The air inside was heavy, still. The faint smell of baby powder lingered in the nursery. Bottles stood rinsed neatly by the sink. A crib was dressed as if ready for a day that would never come. And then, the silence broke into horror. Angela lay lifeless in the bedroom. Near her, the twins were gone too, their cries forever silenced. Even seasoned officers froze. One later said, "It was like walking into a prayer that had been answered and broken at the same time." News of the tragedy spread with the speed of wildfire. Within hours, the quiet Texas town was turned upside down. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering disbelief. Some wept openly, recalling Angela's laughter in recent weeks, her glow, the joy she carried. Others whispered harsher words about choices, about secrets, about betrayal. The prison community reeled. Angela had been their warden, their leader, a figure of discipline and authority. Now, whispers they had once dismissed, about her spending too much time at one inmate's cell, about her distracted gaze, resurfaced, sharper than ever. For some, it was proof of what they had suspected. For others, it was an unbearable stain on her memory. The church responded with sorrow. Vigils were held, candles lined the street, hymns floated into the evening air. Parishioners spoke of Angela's faith, of her years of longing, of a woman who wanted nothing more than to be a mother. Her choices as desperation born of love, of longing, of unbearable emptiness. But her words collapsed under Michael's fury. For him, this was not just betrayal, it was humiliation. A secret he had protected for decades had been ripped open and placed in front of him in flesh and blood. The argument grew louder, sharper, voices rising in a house that had been defined by silence. Angela pleaded. Michael shouted. The storm that had gathered for months finally broke, and then came the violence. It happened swiftly, brutally, rage overwhelming reason. Angela fought, but exhaustion and shock left her weak. Michael's fury left no room for mercy. When it was over, the house was silent again, but not the silence of sleep or routine. It was a silence so heavy it seemed to smother the walls themselves. The twins, voiceless and innocent, were caught in the same storm. Their cries rose briefly, then faded into the same stillness that had swallowed their mother. When the violence ended, Michael stood in the wreckage, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. Around him lay the consequences of secrets too long kept and truths too long hidden. The house that once held longing now held only absence. Neighbors later recalled strange signs that night: a flicker of lights at odd hours, the slam of a door, footsteps pacing back and forth. But no one imagined what was unfolding behind those white shutters. By morning, the Morris home looked unchanged from the street. The porch light glowed. The flowers sat in their neat rows. The shutters stood straight. But inside, the illusion of family had collapsed into a silence no one could ever repair. Morning broke quietly over the neighborhood, the sun casting a golden light across neat lawns and trimmed hedges. From the outside, the Morris home looked unchanged. The porch light still glowed faintly. The flowers Angela had tended still bloomed in rows. But inside, the silence was wrong. The first sign came when Angela did not appear in her garden. She always stepped out early, watering plants before the heat of the day, greeting neighbors with a nod. That morning there was nothing. By afternoon, unease grew. Calls were made. Soon the stillness of the street was broken by the low rumble of police cruisers pulling to a stop at the curb. Officers entered the home expecting routine, a welfare check, perhaps a fainting spell. But what they found was something no training could prepare for. The air inside was heavy, still. The faint smell of baby powder lingered in the nursery. Bottles stood rinsed neatly by the sink. A crib was dressed as if ready for a day that would never come. And then, the silence broke into horror. Angela lay lifeless in the bedroom. Near her, the twins were gone too, their cries forever silenced. Even seasoned officers froze. One later said, "It was like walking into a prayer that had been answered and broken at the same time." News of the tragedy spread with the speed of wildfire. Within hours, the quiet Texas town was turned upside down. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering disbelief. Some wept openly, recalling Angela's laughter in recent weeks, her glow, the joy she carried. Others whispered harsher words about choices, about secrets, about betrayal. The prison community reeled. Angela had been their warden, their leader, a figure of discipline and authority. Now, whispers they had once dismissed, about her spending too much time at one inmate's cell, about her distracted gaze, resurfaced sharper than ever. For some, it was proof of what they had suspected. For others, it was an unbearable stain on her memory. The church responded with sorrow. Vigils were held, candles lined the street, hymns floated into the evening air. Parishioners spoke of Angela's faith, of her years of longing, of a woman who wanted nothing more than to be a mother. And then came the rumors. Quiet at first, but spreading quickly. People spoke in low tones about Michael, how he had always avoided the subject of children, how some claimed he couldn't have them at all. At first it sounded like cruel gossip born from grief. But when investigators pressed Michael in questioning, the truth emerged. He had known for years. He had never been able to father children. The revelation changed everything. Angela's pregnancy, once seen as a miracle, was now reframed as something else. A desperate act, a choice made across a forbidden line. The twins were not Michael's, and he had known it the moment Angela told him she was expecting. The community split in their grief. Some mourned Angela as a woman undone by longing, betrayed by her husband's silence. Others condemned her for stepping into an intimacy that destroyed her family. But whatever side they took, the sorrow remained the same. 3 lives lost, and a town left searching for meaning in the ruins of secrecy. Reporters descended quickly, their headlines sharp and merciless. Infertile husband, forbidden affair, family destroyed. The story spread beyond the town, painting the Morris tragedy as a parable of betrayal and rage. For the prison system, it was more than scandal. It was a crisis of trust. If a warden could fall, who else might be vulnerable? In the end, all the whispers, all the judgments, all the grief circled back to one house. The Morris home still stood with its white shutters, its porch light steady, its flowers in bloom. But to everyone who passed, it was no longer a home. It had become a monument to silence, a silence that had cost 3 lives. In the interrogation room, Michael Morris sat slumped in his chair, his hands clasped, his face ashen. For hours he said little, answering questions with short replies, his eyes fixed on the table. He looked less like a man plotting excuses and more like a man drowning under the weight of something he had carried too long. Detectives pressed gently, circling closer. The pregnancy, the whispers about Angela and an inmate, the twins who could not be explained. At first, Michael deflected, his voice tight. But then, in a moment of collapse, the silence he had carried for decades broke. "I couldn't have children," he muttered, his voice raw, his head bowed. "Not ever." The words hung in the room, heavy and unshakable. For the first time in his life, Michael admitted what he had buried in silence. He had known since his 20s, long before Angela, long before their marriage. He had never told her. He had let her hope, let her pray, let her believe for 15 years, even though he knew the truth. For investigators, the pieces clicked into place. Angela's pregnancy had never been a miracle. The twins were proof of a secret she had carried from within the prison walls. And for Michael, their very existence had ripped open a wound he had hidden from the world. The courtroom that followed was tense. Every seat filled, the air thick with anticipation. Prosecutors portrayed Michael as a man consumed by humiliation, who chose murder over truth. They reminded the jury of the silence he had carried, the violence that had followed, and the two infants who paid the ultimate price. The defense painted him differently. They described a man who had been slowly undone by his own secret, living in a marriage where his deepest shame festered unspoken. They did not deny what he had done. Instead, they asked the jury to see a man broken by years of silence and betrayal. Then came the testimony about Angela's relationship with the inmate. Prison staff spoke of her lingering too long at his cell, of conversations that were hushed but undeniable. Letters surfaced. One guard admitted he had dismissed the rumors at the time, but now realized they had been true. As the inmate himself took the stand, the courtroom stiffened. He spoke carefully, mixing charm with denial, acknowledging Angela's kindness, but refusing to name it as more. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others stared at him with cold disgust. For Angela's family, each word was a knife. The woman they loved now painted in shadows she could no longer defend herself against. But the most painful moments came whenever the twins were mentioned. Each reference tightened the air in the room. They were not just proof of betrayal. They were two lives, innocent and voiceless, caught in the storm of secrets and silence. One juror later said, "Every time their names were spoken, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath." After weeks of testimony, the jury returned. The room fell into silence as the foreman stood. Guilty. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of everything lost. Angela's family wept quietly, hands clasped tightly together. Michael sat motionless, his face unreadable. The silence around him finally shattered, but too late to save anyone. He was sentenced to life in prison. A man who had lived in silence would now spend his days surrounded by the same concrete walls his wife once ruled over. Outside, the town remained divided. Some called it justice, others called it tragedy. For the prison, the scandal left scars that would not fade quickly. But for those who knew the Morrises, the verdict was not closure. It was confirmation of what they had already felt in their bones. In the end, truth was spoken in a courtroom, but far too late for the woman, the children, and the marriage already buried by silence. In the end, the Morris story is not only about a crime, it is about the silence that lived inside a marriage, silence that grew heavier with each passing year until it destroyed everything. Angela longed to be a mother. That longing consumed her, and in her desperation, she crossed a line she should never have crossed. As a prison warden, her duty was to maintain boundaries, to enforce order. Instead, she blurred them. For her, the twins were not simply children, they were redemption, proof that her years of emptiness had not been in vain. But hope born in secrecy is fragile. It rarely survives the weight of truth. Michael, too, carried a secret. His infertility was not just a condition. It was a truth he chose to hide. He let Angela hope for 15 years, knowing those hopes could never be realized. His silence was not protection. It was a wall. And when that wall collapsed, it collapsed violently. And in the middle of it all were the twins, innocent, voiceless, their lives extinguished before they could begin. They became the cruelest symbol of this tragedy, proof of longing, proof of betrayal, proof of secrets left to fester. The Morris case forces us to look inward. How often do we bury truths because we fear the cost of speaking them? How many families fracture under what is left unsaid? Silence may feel like protection in the moment, but left too long, it becomes its own weapon. Angela, Michael, and the twins are gone. Their story cannot be undone, but it remains as a warning that silence, longing, and secrecy can destroy not only the guilty, but the innocent too. So ask yourself, what silences are you carrying? Because silence may protect for a time, but if left unspoken, it can bury everything you love.